Do you know where you are in the translation lifecycle? Well, it's something that I think is very important for businesses to understand. And understanding it using the localization maturity curve is something that you can do and is an exercise that's worthwhile just to kind of understand where your journey will go when it comes to internationalization and what to expect along the route. Um, I'm just going to go through very briefly the localization maturity curve, which is essentially a way of putting your business onto the curve to understand your relationship with your translation vendors and providers, and seeing where you will be going next and what to expect. So, as you can see from this very small little model here, there are 5 stages. Stage number 1 is manual. So the manual stage is something where you've just begun your localization journey and you're expecting to start selling your product service overseas. Now, the first thing you do is understand that obviously there may be a requirement for language translations. In that example, the first place you'll likely look is one of 2 places: translation providers and standard LSP agencies, and then also your internal teams who have the fluency for different languages. Most of the time, you'll have one of the two, if not a combination. Now, this manual phase is a phase where translation is a part of the business, but it's not something that's overwhelming the teams to manage and go for. This is kind of the early stages where vendors, for example, people who provide connectors, APIs, proxies, all of these different things are not necessarily needed. You're managing along and it's fine. What happens to then move to that next stage is the requirement to start scaling that. When you have the initial phase of getting into that market, you may have that it becomes quite successful and you start to see that there is a greater requirement of translations for digital assets, content outside of the website, social media, etc., etc. What happens is that process that you did in the manual phase becomes challenging. So that's where you move to an automated stage to essentially use some kind of automation technology that's going to essentially help your teams manage that process of getting that content from the origin language to the target market you're putting it into. That's typically where you'll see and start to understand people going on the journey of using some level of a connector, an API, or a proxy technology to help you with that translation journey. Essentially, the next phase is after that kind of searching phase to find a technology that works with you and your requirements. Naturally, there are going to be stages and processes where you require a lot more effort to be required for the translation piece. So we naturally would suggest using a technology that works with you. A simple connector can still require a little bit of work, but it works for a lot of businesses that don't have a large volume of content to be translated. When you move to the third stage, you'll see that the vendor support curve dramatically increases. The reason for that is understanding that you've gone from a manual process to an automated process where you're kind of searching out the best way and logical requirements for the business. But the agile phase is really understanding the workflows and processes you'll need to do to make it successful for those international markets. Just getting by with using a translation agency and manually copying and pasting things works initially, but when you have multiple markets simultaneously opening, you need a process and a workflow to go through. So naturally, this is where you find and implement workflows that are associated to it, i.e. we use a connector to do this part of the website and then we translate it offline, or we take a technology like a proxy technology, for example, that does everything for me, and then we can scale at a much more quicker and efficient level. When you become pushed forward onto that, to the centralized process. Essentially, what this means is you're having a process that's quite well formalized and the workflows are clear for adding new markets, i.e., we go into France next, and we know and understand the level of effort that is required for translation and also what is required from the teams, as well as, most importantly, the costs associated with it. You'll find that in this process, you'll probably have a couple of team members that have maybe 25% of their job role taken up with localization. And it's an important part of the business that most importantly returns some kind of ROI. And this is a process where you're starting to think and understand and learn about how you can take this process in-house whilst using vendors to support that, which brings us on to the next stage of expert. Now, your very large companies, multi-billion dollar companies will typically actually have in-house teams managing localization, assuming they're not managing multiple markets in the tens of markets. Now, this is a process where you likely have in-house teams translating the content, uploading it to however they use, and vendors supporting that by providing connections via APIs or proxy technologies, whatever you want to look at to do that. Naturally, what tends to happen then is that the vendors start to taper off because essentially you're taking that process in-house and managing it that way. Anyway, hope that's been relatively useful. I think, again, it's very useful to know where you are on that curve because you can expect to put yourself into one of the positions and understand in the next 3 to 5 years what the likely scenarios you will go through to push on through the localization. Yes, hope it's been useful. Thanks very much.